Hello everyone, my name is Paula Lawale Johnson. I work with the Science-Based Target Network, supporting corporate engagement. I welcome you to our third module of our training program, during which we'll cover step 2 of our 5-step target setting process, interpret and prioritize. On our last session, we saw BSR, who co-developed our training program with us, introduce to you step 1. On today's session, we'll have another supporting partner called Quantis, who has experience in target setting with companies, present to you this module. Before diving into the contents of our step 2 module, let's have a quick recap of key concepts behind our Train the Trainer program, the rationale behind launching the program, and our learning objectives for today. As we move along the curriculum, I would like to share with you a quick reminder on the intended use and purpose of this program. Modules are recommended to be completed in a sequential order. Each module should take you about 60 to 90 minutes to complete. At the end of each module, users have the option to pass a test to validate the understanding of the learning objectives. Starting from 2024, passing the test will be required for all those individuals belonging to an NGO or a consulting firm supporting target setters that wish to remain or be part of SBTN's referral program. After completing this training, you will be able to 1. Gain a clear understanding and practical expertise in applying the recommended methods. You will also be able to build your confidence in using our tools and resources while understanding the criteria for acceptable data and tools. Thirdly, you'll know where to turn to for guidance on interpreting methods. And finally, you'll feel empowered to contribute to SBTN's method development by sharing your insights and experiences. And on what we do not expect you to do after completing this training, basically you don't have to reinvent the wheel by coming up with, for example, alternative approaches to impact screening and assessment. Remember, our curriculum comprises of 5 initial modules covering the first 3 steps of our methods, as well as a general overview training which establishes the foundation for engaging the target setting process. Modules are expected to be completed in a sequential order, starting with the general overview module, followed by step 1. We are now in module 3, which addresses step 2, after which we will advance to step 3 in modules 4 and 5. In our last module, we explored SBTN Step 1 methods. We learned how to define an organizational boundary and to identify which direct operations and upstream activities are in scope. We also covered how to use the materiality screening tool to screen for environmental materiality and to quantify environmental pressures. Finally, we looked at how to screen for the state of nature and to combine that with pressure estimates for each activity location pair, depending on the data we have available. Now that these concepts have been refreshed, let's dive into the objectives and contents we're going to cover in this module for step 2 with our partners from Quantis.
Hello everyone, I'm Simon Gillet and I'm the Global Nature Lead for Quantis. I had the great opportunity to be a seconded expert to the SBTN 2 years ago, and also to participate in the co-development of the guidance, but also to pilot and test the target setting approaches. And I will be covering this training with my colleague Julie. So this module will help you to achieve 3 core objectives and will help you master the basics of step 2. And how it fits into the overall framework. It will also help you, of course, to understand how to conduct step 2A, step 2B, so how to adequately determine target boundaries for each pressure, how to interpret and rank locations within the target boundary, but also to understand how to conduct step 2C. So this is mainly how to identify top environmental priority sites, but also how to determine the feasibility and the strategic aspects of some priorities. Okay, so now let's go into the actual content of step 2. So our first objective is to understand step 2, how it fits into the 5-step framework and what are the intended objectives and the outputs. So at the core of our tools, methods, and guidance for setting targets, There is a 5-step process that takes company all the way from assessing the impacts with regards to specific pressures, identifying what parts of the operations and in which location to focus on, to set then targets, all the way to measuring, reporting, and verifying progress against those targets, which are the last steps. Two unique aspects of this approach are first, that these targets are spatially explicit, reflecting the needs of nature and locations that company pressures occur. And secondly, that actions must be guided by the SBTN's action framework. So avoid, reduce, regenerate, restore, and transform framework. So this is a hierarchy of action that are consistent with a conservation and mitigation hierarchy of actions. And we are now at the second step of this process. So in step one, companies would have estimated the environmental pressures that result from their activities, as well as the state of nature in their value chain locations. In this second step, a company uses the information from step one to determine which science-based targets to set, which locations and economic activities to include within target boundaries, and where to act first to mitigate the most significant negative impacts on nature and increase the potential for positive impacts. So the objective of this step two is really to rank all locations within target boundaries by the importance of action, and then to define a short list of top priority locations for target setting. So step two is divided into 3 sub-steps. The first step, which is step 2A, will be about determining and defining the target boundaries for 5 key pressures categories. So water use, water pollution, soil pollution, land use, and land use change. And these boundaries will cover both direct operations and upstream activities. Some activities in the upstream with limited traceability will be set aside for now. Then in step 2B, we will rank locations by making environmental indicators comparable. This involves normalizing data, harmonizing spatial scales, and integrating pressure and state of nature indicators to show where action is most critical. Finally, in step 2C, we will refine new rankings further by evaluating dependencies, financial materiality, stakeholder engagement, and of course, co-benefits. So these steps helps you finalize your top priority locations. The specific inputs and outputs required across the different value chain segment in scope of the 1.1 methods are outlined on the right hand of the slide for your reference. So by the end of step 2, you will have a clearly defined where to set science-based targets and prioritize locations based on the environmental impact. So now that our main objectives for performing step 2 are clear, let's look at how to conduct its first 2 sub-steps. So steps 2A and step 2B. Before we get started, we just would like to kick off by highlighting those 5 tasks that you will be expected to do for steps 2A and 2B. So these will allow you to build a combined ranking of locations considering robust environmental factors. So your first task will be to define target boundaries for each pressure category. Volumes with insufficient value chain traceability will then be placed in target boundary B. You will then harmonize and normalize special units. And from this, you will be able to create index values for all pressure categories. Finally, using these index values, you will be able to rank locations according to their environmental urgency to act.
Hello everyone, I'm Julie Christian and I am an expert in the nature team at Qantas. Over the past year, I've had the great opportunity to participate in the target setting pilot, and I've also collaborated with the SBTN to improve the clarity of the data requirements in the guidances. To set science-based targets for nature, companies must define target boundaries for each pressure category identified as material in step 1. Target boundaries are the set of company activities with their associated material pressures that are covered by a specific target. Company activities include direct operation activities and, in separate target boundaries, the activities in the upstream value chain. Companies must set separate data on upstream activities and direct operations. The direct operations target boundary for each pressure must include all material activities in the company's direct operations at a spatial scale compatible with their pressure and state of nature. Upstream target boundaries are required for each material pressure for all companies' activities shown to be material in Step 1A. There is no reduction in the scope of activities covered between the value chain assessment in Step 1B and the target boundary definition. Companies must also not combine data between pressure categories or between state of natures, as the units, values, and spatial temporal resolutions may not be compatible. For instance, estimates of water use and land use change across sites and value chains cannot be combined. All estimates of pressures must be analyzed separately. One key difference in defining target boundaries for direct operations versus upstream activities is the availability of data and the level of uncertainty for upstream activities. For direct operations, there is a single target boundary for each material pressure. Inside that target boundary, you will have to classify locations into two data levels. Data level 1 includes locations that have the precision needed for setting targets in Step 3. Data level 2 includes locations with some national level data, but not precise enough yet for setting targets. For upstream activities, there are two boundaries per material pressure. Target boundary A includes locations with sufficient geographic precision, at least at the subnational level known or estimated. Inside that target boundary, we can distinguish between two levels of data availability. Data level 1 includes locations that are precise enough to set targets in Step 3. Data level 2 includes locations at subnational scales, but that are not currently at the level needed to set location-specific targets. You must include at least some upstream activities in target boundary A to proceed with the target setting. Target boundary B includes locations with insufficient geographic precision, that is only known at broader national or global level, and that cannot easily be refined at subnational scale. Once activities are placed into target boundary B, they will not be included in subsequent substeps of Step 2 or in Step 3. However, prioritization exercises will help guide your efforts to improve traceability for target B for future target setting. When it is necessary to define target boundary A and target boundary B, companies will need to specify the percentage of their activities in volume that falls in either category. As you may remember from the last module, Usus Nourishment is a food and beverage producer specialized in plant-based drinks and food. Usus has directly owned and operated manufacturing facilities clustered in Belgium, France, Germany, Spain, and the UK. The company is involved in crop production, processing of raw commodities, and packaging of finished goods. It purchases major commodities including almonds, cocoa, corn, maize, soybeans, and timber in the form of paperboard, as well as other ingredients such as sugar from sugarcane and additives. The company is part of the initial group of companies setting science-based targets for nature that have trialed SBTN methods. This case study is based on the latest revisions of the guidance. In this figure, an example of Usus' target boundary is shown for water use for direct operations. The map shows the outlines of the basins in which the company operates that are material for water use. The colors within the basins indicate water availability, so the state of nature within the basins, with darker red colors indicating basins at greater risk of water scarcity. The company may begin by setting targets in just a few of these locations, but will be expected to set targets to manage impacts in all of them over time. In Step 2A Task 1, Any upstream activities where locations are not known at subnational level and for which it isn't feasible to achieve this level of visibility over the value chains in the short term should be left out of target boundary A and placed into target boundary B. These activities and locations in target boundary B will be excluded from all subsequent tasks in Step 2 and Step 3. Companies should group these activities, their associated volumes and locations, including unknown locations, and label them as name of pressure category, upstream target boundary B. Target boundary B was introduced in the methods to increase the method's feasibility given the current realities of companies regarding supply chain traceability. Note that although these activities will not be removed from the process of setting science-based targets using the SBTN method, they may still be required actions that companies will need to undertake to manage the associated impacts. Looking ahead, the SBTN recommends companies to increase their traceability of these volumes and will require companies to transition all volumes from target boundary B to target boundary A in 5 years for freshwater and by the target date for land. SBTN is also developing complementary guidance to support companies to increase value chain traceability. So to sum up, our main outputs of this task will be a delineated upstream target boundary B for each of the pressure categories. For its upstream activities, URSUS was well placed to start with science-based targets for nature because it already had traceability for its most important high-impact commodities. This meant that most commodities could be included in target boundary A and carried through into Step 3. For upstream operations, any activity without subnational level data, such as the timber or the sugarcane purchases in URSUS case, would be placed in target boundary B. Because the URSUS team was not able to confirm the sourcing location for its timber and sugarcane purchases during the timeframe of the assessment, it marked those volumes and estimated locations within its target boundary B. This meant that commodities in target boundary B comprised about 30% of URSUS total purchase volumes. Therefore, the company was able to meet SBTN's requirements for purchases of raw commodities that make up above 0% of all upstream activity that will be captured in target boundary A before proceeding to target setting in Step 3. And it also meets the SBTN recommendation that at least 50% of all upstream activity be captured in target boundary A. Now that that's clear, let's look at how to group activities into harmonized spatial units. For each location within each pressure category, the spatial scale of the pressure data per activity must be consistent with state of nature data for the activity in a given location. The pressure and state of nature indicators associated with each of a company's activities will likely have been defined at different spatial scales. For example, a pressure indicator might be associated with a regional or provincial level, while the associated state of nature indicator might refer to a more granular scale, such as water basin level. This means that spatial units will have to be harmonized. The pressure state of nature pair will need to be at the same or compatible spatial scales. To do so, if there are two scales used for some activity, select the one that is coarser in each case. For example, less specific, less granular, such as the regional level instead of the coordinate. You will also need to group all activities that fall within the same location. So sum up pressure values and use the average, the median, or any similar summary statistic for the state of nature values. You will try to keep locations as granular as possible to align with Step 3 data needs throughout this harmonization process. Once you have harmonized the data sets, you will have to normalize the data so you can apply equal weights to both your pressure and state of nature values when calculating your index pressure. As a reminder, normalization is the process of transforming and rescaling data to fit within a consistent range, typically from 0 to 1. To do so, when it comes to pressure values, the SBTN recommends rescaling to the company maximum of that pressure, such that 0 is 0 and 1 equals the company maximum. As for state of nature values, you want to rescale to the dataset maximum regardless of the maximum of what the company has, such that 0 is 0 and 1 is the state of nature dataset maximum. Before going into step 2b, there's a 5-step checklist to follow to ensure that you are ready to tackle step 2b. First, you want to verify a company has complete information and data from step 1. You must ensure that you're using the same data sets indicated in the step 1 guidance for estimating state of nature pressures and the units specified for the pressure data. Second, you need to confirm that you have properly interpreted the results derived from the tools and methods used for the state of nature pressure metrics and indicators. As a reminder, higher values should always be interpreted as requiring more urgent actions. So a higher pressure is interpreted as indicating more potential damage from an economic activity, and a higher state of nature value is interpreted as a greater damage already felt by the ecosystem. Thirdly, you want to check that you have prepared justificative evidence for the tools and datasets you have used, as well as explanations for how these were used. Fourth, you want to confirm the company's pressure and state of nature data are at the same spatial resolution for the same location. Finally, you must check that your company's pressure and state of nature data are expressed within the same range, that is between 0 and 1, and using the same consistent logic. So that 0, for instance, is that the ecosystem is intact with no action needed, and that 1 means that you need immediate action with little or no ecosystem that's left intact. As a final reminder, if you used multiple state of pressure metrics for a given pressure category, you must take the highest value for each indicator. For instance, for freshwater use, the pressure state of nature data, companies must take the highest estimated value within a given spatial scale of analysis, so for instance, a basin or an ecoregion, after normalizing between value ranges if they have used multiple data sets.
So we are now in the midst of step 2b. To kick us off, we will have to calculate index values for each pressure. So the index value, or the pressure sensitive index, IP, is the normalized pressure P multiplied by the relevant normalized pressure sensitive state of nature value, SONP. Both need to be harmonized at the same spatial scale. So first, you must calculate index values for all location, activity, and commodity pairs that are material for each pressure, meaning that these index values must be computed independently for upstream activities and also direct operations. Companies must combine pressure and state of nature data for each location relevant to that pressure. So, in example, each direct operation activity known to have water pollution impact. So we will use the equation above, which is IP, which equals to the pressure times the state of nature for the pressure. As for what to include for this index calculation, the calculation process must only be applied to locations for which the spatial resolution is either 1. aligned with the spatial resolution requirements for step 3, such as water basin, for example, level 5, for water quantity targets, or at subnational scale that is coarser than the step 3 requirements, but consistent with step 1b requirements. You might be wondering how one might run the index calculation when there is a need for a normalization and harmonization process. And so here we will show you just that. As we just seen, harmonization is the process of ensuring the pressure and the associated state of nature metric, SONP, are at the same spatial scale. So companies that used multiple state of nature metrics for a given pressure category in their value chain assessment, so the step 1B, must harmonize the spatial scale between datasets and normalize the data from 0 to 1 for all the state of nature metrics. They will then combine them into a single state of nature dataset by taking the highest value across all the indicators. So you will be then able to use this metric for your index value calculations before ranking. Here's an example of how a company, so Ursus in our example, normalized values for pressures and states of nature for one location of a direct operations activity, here manufacturing in France. Once pressure data and state of nature data were harmonized at the same spatial scale, the team rescaled, meaning normalized, the values in both datasets. Remember, this must be done before moving on to applying the index rule. So for the pressure values, the team rescaled the pressures relative to maximum value of the company in the given pressure dataset. The equation the company used for this pressure was site value divided by maximum value of company's pressure dataset. For the state of nature values, the team, Ursus, scales these data relative to the global maximum value, so 5 in that case, for the global water stress dataset. So in order to normalize the data, the team therefore needed to begin by converting the categorical scores to quantitative scores appropriate to the range used in the tool, so 1 to 5, where 1 is very low, 2 is low, 3 medium, 4 high, and 5 very high. So in this case study, for all categorical state variables, a 5 equates to the most degraded, meaning the least amount of water available. And the equation that Ursus used to normalize state value was site value divided by maximum value of global dataset. So in order to really derive easily comparable and combinable values. As an example, using the equation above, the company calculated the following values for its French manufacturing site, such as normalized pressure value for water use, meaning 10,000 divided by 10,000, so 0.7, and then normalized state value for water availability, so 4 divided by 5, 0.8. In the prior slide, we calculated the normalized pressure and state of nature for an activity location pair for direct operations. So using these values, we can now calculate the pressure sensitivity index value, IP, using the equation IP equal pressure times state of nature, pressure specific. And so we get here IP for water use, that would be 0.7 times 0.8 equals 0.56. And so we can repeat this exercise calculating index values for every other location in this target boundary, water use. For example, for manufacturing activities in the UK, multiplying the normalized pressure and normalized state of nature, we get the pressure sensitive index value 0.3 times 0.5, here 0.15. And now that the index value for each pressure has been calculated, the company will be able to rank sites connected to a given pressure from high to low, taking higher values to mean higher priority for action. Now that you have calculated index values for each material pressure, we can now move on to ranking sites connected to a given pressure from high to low. Companies should go through ranking processes for upstream activities and direct operations by each target boundary for each material pressure separately. So for this task, you will have to create two separate rankings, one based on the index pressure, so IP values, and one based on the biodiversity state of nature values. And then we will combine them. The combination exercise will be detailed in the following slides once we address how to calculate and rank biodiversity state of nature values. For now, we will focus on ranking locations based on their index pressure values from highest to lowest. So taking the higher index values to mean higher priority for action and then for each pressure. On the right hand of the slide, you can see an example of two locations ranked according to their index value only within Ursus direct operations. Note that later on, once you perform the same task for a biodiversity state of nature's value, you will then have to integrate these two separate rankings into a combined ranking, exclusions from rankings and further inclusions in SBTN target setting process. For freshwater targets, meaning water use and water pollution, companies may exclude sites that fall within direct operations and upstream target boundary A with negligible pressures. So companies may only do so when, one, they have data at water basin level, so which is Fafsetter 5 for water quantity and Fafsetter level 4 for quality, or two, the pressure accounts for less than 1% of the total pressure for that specific pressure category, or three, the state of nature in the location is healthy and then indicating little need to change. So either the resolution is bad, or it's a meaningless overall pressure, or indeed the location is already healthy. We will need to create a second ranking that integrates indeed the state of nature of biodiversity values. So in order to do this, you will first have to calculate biodiversity scores for all target boundaries, unless this has been done before, and then rank locations based on these scores. So some additional guidance on biodiversity state of natures that we use. So the SBTN requires the use of at least two biodiversity variables to evaluate biodiversity state of natures. So an indicator at ecosystem level and an indicator at species level. So the ecosystem level indicator can be covered by a pressure sensitive indicator for the state of nature, such as EII, so Ecosystem Integrity Index, for example, which would be a state of nature for pressure for land use and land use change. It can also be used as a state of nature for biodiversity indicator for ecosystems. The SBTN recommends the use of multiple datasets focused on different dimensions of biodiversity, as we said just before, so ideally at both the species and the ecosystem level. The rationale for using multiple datasets is that it brings the possibility to better analyze because they capture different elements of the environment, so multiple biodiversity aspects. Note that when using multiple metrics on biodiversity in the value chain assessment, companies will have to harmonize, normalize the data before combining into a single state of nature on biodiversity dataset to use it in the ranking process. So if we use an ecosystem integrity index indicator and one on species, we need indeed to combine both together. So remember, ranks for all locations within each target boundary are only finalized once the company introduces the biodiversity state of nature indicators, and it evaluates the respective rank for each site according to both the pressure index and the biodiversity indicator. So building on the initial index ranking, the Ursus team introduced the state of nature of biodiversity indicators, so SO and B, and evaluated the respective rank for each site according to both the pressure index, so IP, and the biodiversity indicators for both species and ecosystem-related aspects. To facilitate the ranking exercise, the team added this information to its ranked dataset as a new column. So the team generated rankings of locations, one for each pressure state combination using the index value, and two, a ranking of the locations based on the biodiversity state of nature metrics. So the team then created the combined ranking by alternating between pressure index and biodiversity state of nature rankings. Here, the rankings goes highest pressure index, then highest biodiversity state of nature, next highest pressure index, and so on. In cases where these are ties, as you can see, the combined ranking usually solves those as a tie will mostly often only appear in one of the rankings. In this case, given the pressure index ranking for Belgium is higher than the one for Germany, even though their biodiversity state of nature is tied, Belgium takes higher priority in the ranking. So the SBTN team has developed several tools to help guide you through the target setting process. So both the corporate manual and case study give broad overviews of each process in the journey. The data needs table explicitly states what type of data you will need at each step of the process, which could feed directly into the self-assessment tool. There is also the self-assessment tool, of course, that asks targeted questions based off the SBTN requirements to ensure that you are ready for submission. The data submission templates, on the other hand, and the validation submission forms are the preferred formats for data and associated information for the validation of science-based targets for nature. With that in mind, let's look at the list of items the validation team will be expecting to see. So the validation team will, for example, require an interpretation guidance for all the pressure state of natures and biodiversity state of nature dataset used, confirmation that the company used the maximum value of the normalized datasets for pressure state of nature and biodiversity state of nature for each locations. So now, let's move on to our third objective, conducting a step 2C, which is required, of course, adding feasibility and strategic insights into the priority.
Step 2C, the prioritization, is the moment where you're bringing social justice and stakeholder priorities, business dependencies on nature, and other strategic priorities, including risks and financial materiality. You can also further prioritize by applying a cutoff within each individual target boundary, or consider the potential for synergies across target boundaries to determine top priority locations to advance in initial target setting. If you do not apply the prioritization approach, then you will have to address all the sites during the first round of target setting. In Step 2C, companies are asked to introduce additional data in their prioritization approach to better integrate environmental and social and financial considerations in their target setting approach. Companies will need to consider at least one of the following three complementary aspects. Firstly, in Task 6, stakeholder engagement, and/or company dependencies on nature, which correspond to Task 7, and other considerations such as feasibility and strategic interest, which I explained in Task 8. These additional considerations should complement, but not replace, the analysis that is completed in earlier parts of Step 2. The information gathered in these tasks must indeed sit alongside the impact-based ranking produced in Step 2B to inform prioritization. You must provide a written explanation supporting any rankings coming from these complementary approaches so that the validators can interpret and improve the reasoning for re-ranking the most materially relevant sites from an impact perspective. Validators may also ask for additional justification before approving the company's prioritization based on financial, strategic, or social considerations. Let's start with Task 6. Consideration of social and rights-based perspective are critical to ensure that the science-based targets contribute to global goals such as those of the Global Biodiversity Framework and the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals. What's more, stakeholder rights and needs can also influence a company's prioritization of locations within some of their target boundaries, or lead to the identification of locations which should be prioritized across boundaries due to this consideration. As such, companies might wish to conduct an initial stakeholder mapping exercise within their top-ranked locations, focusing on local stakeholder needs and existing stakeholder relationships. As the company deepens its knowledge of each location relevant to its target setting journey, it will iterate on this exercise and will continue to engage with local stakeholders to set and achieve its science-based targets for nature. Before engaging with local stakeholders, companies should first build internal capabilities in the following areas: preparedness for engagement, designing and conducting engagement, and finally enabling participation. If applying this approach, companies will need to provide the information that is required in the stakeholder engagement guidance. That will mean providing data for each location on stakeholder needs and relationships when known. Within this list of areas and basins within target boundaries, SBTN will look for information on rights and needs of Indigenous peoples and other affected communities, the relevant local stakeholders to consult while developing and implementing targets, prior relationships that exist between the companies and its value chain stakeholders and local stakeholders, desire and capacity of local stakeholders for engaging with the company on setting and implementing and tracking targets. And finally, the preference and demands of company level stakeholders. So they may be subsidiaries, investors, shareholders, etc. For step 2 submissions, companies may indicate if the stakeholder engagement part is currently unknown. Those that are not able to complete the assessment for all locations should at least complete these for the locations that have begun to emerge as highest priority. Assessing business dependencies on nature is the second of the 3 prioritization approaches in Step 2C. So why should you assess dependencies? Understanding your company's reliance on ecosystem services helps you gauge the risk of financial loss if those services degrade, and it highlights opportunities to increase positive impacts. For validation, you can evaluate dependencies descriptively, explaining the importance of ecosystem services for freshwater or land target, or through dependency scoring. If data is unavailable for some location, that's acceptable at this stage. When evaluating dependencies, you may use a variety of data sets. Some of the recommended data sets include the dependency screening data in Encore. You may also refer to the nature risk profile methodology for more information on calculating dependencies at the locations of operations or sourcing using spatial data. You may also want to refer to the task force for nature financial disclosure to incorporate nature-related risks and opportunities into your strategic planning. Beyond business dependencies, companies may wish to consider other factors that influence their ability to take effective actions. Companies may use any combination of these factors to rank highest opportunity locations for target setting. It is not mandatory for companies to use data from all factors to inform their evaluation. The factors that can be used to inform the strategic and feasibility evaluation are described below. So some of the key considerations include data availability and target setting readiness. So that means selecting sites for which data quality is higher or where the company is more confident in its ability to access the information and set targets. Another consideration is regarding regulatory risks. That is considering what are the current but also evolving policies in different regions, and especially regions where transparency and impact monitoring are critical. Another dimension that you may want to consider is reputational risks. So that means looking at whether there are any locations or commodities for which your company might be highly scrutinized or where leadership opportunities are important. Finally, you may also want to consider the strategic significance of a particular commodity or business line linked to corporate mission and goals, financial materiality, or impacting the company's growth strategy. Existing levels for change or opportunities to scale and learn might also be relevant. When submitting for validation, your ranked locations should be paired with your impact-based ranking to inform cutoffs on sites. A written explanation supporting this ranking must be provided so that the validators can interpret and improve the reasoning for re-ranking the most material relevant sites from an impact perspective. In addition to that, note that validators may ask for additional justification before approving this proposed prioritization. Now that we've covered the 3 approaches for prioritization, let's highlight some key considerations. First, remember that prioritization can only happen after having completed boundary definition and ranking in steps 2A and step 2B. and it must be applied within each target boundary, so not across them. You will need to record evidence for your revised rankings, explaining what are the factors that are considered, with at least one required among stakeholder engagement, business dependencies, or strategic interests that we have seen just before. Explain why the factors that you have chosen are relevant and which data sources you use to evaluate them. Companies must retain in this process the full rank list of location and activities that are identified as priorities in Step 2B. They can then provide this with the results of their evaluation. That means, for example, as a column of additional information and table of ranked locations. Companies will be required to attach the Step 2 criteria and results alongside Step 2B results to demonstrate how additional considerations modify the priorities. Companies should follow these steps in order to apply the prioritization process. So first, prepare your data. Then, apply impact-based results that corresponds to Step 2B. And then have this additional considerations perspective that we saw in Step 2C. To strengthen the prioritization, companies are recommended to use a co-benefits approach when possible. This exercise can help companies identify locations that emerge as priorities for multiple pressure categories and begin setting targets and acting on these first. As an example, using the co-benefits approach, companies might identify a site that is in the top 10% of sites in both its water use and water pollution target boundaries for direct operations and choose to focus on target setting here first. If using this approach, companies will be required to explain the rationale used, the list of site skips, and future target setting plans. Please note that if skipping any high priority basins within a given target boundary to focus on these co-benefits, companies must advance multiple science-based targets in those locations in accordance with the co-benefits approach and provide sufficient evidence for their reprioritization. Before proceeding with the methods from Step 3 freshwater to Step 3 land, companies may apply cutoffs to define further in which locations they want to start setting science-based targets. These cutoffs can be applied boundary by boundary or across multiple boundaries for synergies, such as the co-benefit approach we applied just before. For freshwater targets on freshwater use and freshwater pollution, companies are required to select the highest 10% of basins or the top 10 basins if there are more than 100 basins in each target boundary, as top priority basins for the first round of science-based targets. The ranking of basins may be different for water quantity than water quality, depending on the company's pressures and state of nature at each site. Companies setting targets in basins that don't fall within this top priority category, in addition to the highest ranked, will be allowed to use predefined global hydrological models, which enable a greatly reduced resource investment for model selection. So why should companies follow this cutoff? So freshwater Step 3 requires quite a high level of resource investment due to the use of local hydrological models. So to allow companies to focus their resources on the most important basins, companies are recommended to apply the cutoff. Please note that the cutoffs should be used consistent with the guidance in Step 3, freshwater. Therefore, companies are still invited to consult the Step 3 methods for further guidance in this prioritization and cutoff process. Companies that decide to not follow this prioritization process will be required to treat all basins as if they were top priority category, and will be required to seek local hydrological models for each of these basins, so requiring an important resource investment for finding all those local hydrological models. For land, note that the prioritization approach is not applicable for the first two targets of the land methods, so the no conversion of natural ecosystems and the land footprint reduction targets. for the direct operations and upstream target boundary A. If you're planning to set the landscape engagement target, companies are recommended to use the top 10% of areas within the target boundaries for land use change, and or soil pollution. Companies will be required to identify in one initiative that covers these top 10% of basins, or 2 landscape initiatives, regardless of their size, within these target boundaries. If using the top 10%, companies should include sites that cover at least 10% of the total direct operations and at least 10% of the upstream target boundary, respectively. To zoom in a little bit more on those landscape initiatives, when there's no landscape initiative in priority areas, companies are required to either consult their target boundary ranking to identify the next priority areas to be covered within this target, or develop new landscape initiatives in the top location following the principles outlined by ICL. Note that if you're applying the land footprint reduction target in addition to the landscape engagement target, you will be required to use additional approaches for prioritization to incorporate additional requirements on the restoration of lands taken out of active agricultural production in the selection of your landscape initiatives. You will also be required to submit justifications if you're not able to address the 10% target boundary area in the first year for the landscape engagement target. For further information, you can refer to the Step 3 guidance on land. Companies can submit a prioritization plan for target boundary B to explain how they will improve traceability and move volumes into target boundary A. Although it is strongly recommended by the SBTN, it is not mandatory and it won't be validated by the SBTN team. That being said, companies must transition all activities from target boundary B to target boundary A by the target date that is selected for the land target following the land guidance, and within 5 years for freshwater targets. Some volumes may remain untraceable. The SBTN will provide further guidance on these cases. Why should your company use this approach? When commodity origins are only known at national or continental scale, companies may want to use information about potential impacts of those commodities in those locations to prioritize their traceability improvement efforts, as well as supply and landscape engagement investments. In the absence of any information about the commodity origins, companies can prioritize efforts across commodity supply chains and suppliers based on impacts, risks, and opportunities associated with other characteristics of these segments of their supply chains. Meanwhile, companies with greater dependency or greater income or revenue associated with a given commodity can prioritize traceability and transparency for that commodity for strategic value as well as for environmental impacts. To get 2C validated by the SBTN's team, you'll need both core documentation and justifications. For the core documentation, you must present your impact-based results from Step 2B alongside with your additional prioritization criteria and outcomes from Step 2C. You will also have justifications and additional supporting evidence where you will need to explain which prioritization factors were used, why they were relevant for your company, the data sources you relied on. If you used the co-benefits approach, you also want to include a list of the skipped sites and how they'll be assessed in future target setting. You will also need a time-bound plan to increase the coverage of your material areas in your target boundaries, especially for high priority and low feasibility locations in Step 2B that are not included in the first round. You should also ensure that there is an increased coverage of material activities in your target boundary A, and that activities and commodities from target boundary B are moved to target boundary A. As covered in this module, we have seen that there are specific requirements depending on the targets you will be setting in Step 3 for freshwater and for land. For the validation of Step 2C, the validation team will expect for freshwater to have a list of all basin locations for each target boundary and the basin locations shortlisted for the first round of target setting. As explained before, companies are recommended to select the highest 10% of basins, or 10 basins if they have more than 100 basins in each target boundary, as top priority basins for the current round of science-based targets. For land, as noted previously, the prioritization approach is not applicable for the no conversion of natural ecosystems and the land footprint reduction targets. For the landscape engagement target, companies are recommended to use the outcome of their land use and land use change and soil pollution target boundary combined rankings to identify either a top priority landscape with an initiative that could cover 10% of the company's target boundary for land use and land use change or soil pollution, or to use the ranking to identify 2 priority landscape initiatives, regardless of their size, within these target boundaries. Whether it be for freshwater or for land, if the companies do not follow the mandated cutoffs or requirements, companies will need to provide adequate data and justification for any deviations. So what are the validation criteria associated with those requirements? Firstly, the prioritization must not change the environmental significance ranking. To ensure that this is the case, results of impact-based results from Step 2B and risk-based results based on Step 2C must be provided side by side so that the validation team can understand the prioritization criteria followed by each company. The prioritization must also be performed separately for each target boundary. So, for example, for freshwater, you will include both a target boundary for water use, a target boundary for water pollution, and separating the target boundaries for direct operations and upstream to ensure that all the aspects are adequately addressed, even if synergies for target setting are later found via the co-benefits approach. Finally, while requirements on cutoffs may seem stringent, these have been set to ensure that companies are ready for the target setting processes and requirements in Step 3.
So this marks the end of our third module. And what are the lessons learned you should live with? So in Step 1, you estimated the environmental pressures and the states of nature across your value chain. However, that only shows where those pressures exist, not where to focus your target setting efforts. So Step 2 helps prioritize locations by evaluating pressures against the environmental health at each site. So this process also factors in societal and corporate needs along with feasibility and risks. The main goal of Step 2 is to rank all locations within your target boundaries based on urgency and then create a short list of top priority locations for setting science-based targets in Step 3. So if we summarize, Step 2A involves defining target boundaries for 4 pressure categories across both direct operations and upstream segments. Step 2B interprets and ranks these locations by normalizing and harmonizing the environmental data to create a combined ranking. And finally, in Step 2C, you refine these ranking by incorporating additional factors such as stakeholder engagement, business dependencies, and strategic priorities. This helps ensure that you are addressing the highest priority locations for both environmental and also business outcomes. So that was it for our third module. Thanks for attending. And in the next module, we will be focusing on Step 3 on freshwater targets.